The cashier's hand trembled as she reached for the crumpled $20 bill. Something about the woman across the counter made her pause, not the weathered flight jacket or the silver hair pulled back in a regulation bun, but the way she carried herself, like someone who had seen the edge of the world and walked back to tell about it. "That'll be 1947, ma'am," the cashier whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of fluorescent lights in the small military surplus store outside Camp Pendleton. The woman nodded, counting out exact change with fingers that moved with mechanical precision. Behind her, three Marines in desert utilities had formed an impromptu line, their conversation dying mid-sentence when they noticed her jacket. The faded squadron patch on her shoulder read, VMA 231 Ace of Spades, a Harrier unit that hadn't existed for over a decade. The first Marine, a lance corporal with fresh deployment ribbons, squinted at the patch. His buddy elbowed him, pointing at something else, a small, nearly invisible pin near her left breast pocket. It was shaped like a tiny silver aircraft, wings spread in eternal flight. "Holy shit," the lance corporal breathed, too quiet for anyone but his squadmates to hear. "That's a distinguished flying cross." The woman at the register finished counting her change, methodically placing each coin in a small leather pouch. She turned to leave, and that's when the Marines saw her face fully for the first time. Weathered by sun and wind, marked by lines that spoke of decisions made at 30,000 feet where hesitation meant death. Her eyes held that thousand-yard stare they'd all learned to recognize, the look of someone who had danced with death and led others through the same deadly waltz. As she moved toward the door, the lance corporal did something that would later be talked about in barracks from California to North Carolina. Without thinking, without orders, he snapped to attention and rendered a sharp salute. His two buddies followed instantly, their heels clicking together on the worn linoleum floor. The woman stopped. For a moment, her shoulders seemed to carry the weight of something heavier than the small bag of supplies in her hand. She turned, and her eyes found each of their faces in turn. There was surprise there, and something that might have been gratitude, but mostly there was a sadness so deep it seemed to pull the light from the room. She returned their salute with movements so crisp they could have been carved from stone, then nodded once. "Semper Fi, Marines," she said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of command. Then she was gone, leaving behind only questions and the lingering scent of aviation fuel that seemed to follow old pilots like a shadow. The story of Major Valentina, Ghost, Reyes had just begun to resurface after 15 years of carefully maintained silence. What those Marines didn't know was that they had just saluted a legend who wasn't supposed to exist. In the weeks that followed, that simple moment of recognition would ripple through military circles like shockwaves from a distant explosion. Social media posts appeared and disappeared within hours, scrubbed by unseen hands. Phone calls were made to Pentagon offices that officially didn't exist. Files were pulled from archives buried so deep that accessing them required clearances most generals would never see. But the truth has a way of surfacing, especially when it involves a pilot who once changed the course of a war with nothing but skill, determination, and a willingness to fly into hell itself. The three Marines who saluted her that day had unknowingly broken 15 years of official silence around Operation Ghostwalk, a mission so classified that its participants were erased from public record, their heroism buried beneath layers of national security. Major Valentina Reyes had been the best Harrier pilot the Marine Corps had ever produced. She could thread a needle at Mach 0.8 and land on a carrier deck, in weather that grounded every other aircraft in the fleet. Her call sign, Ghost, came not from her elusive flying style, but from her uncanny ability to appear exactly where the enemy least expected her, striking like a phantom before vanishing into empty sky. She had flown 847 combat missions across 3 theaters of war, accumulating decorations that read like a greatest hits collection of American military valor. 2 distinguished flying crosses, 5 air medals, 3 Navy Commendation Medals with Combat V, and a Silver Star that had been presented in a ceremony so secret that no photographs existed. Her squadron mates called her the Angel of Death, not because she brought death, but because she had a supernatural ability to cheat it. But all of that had been before Somalia, before the mission that officially never happened, where she had flown into the teeth of a surface-to-air missile network to extract a downed reconnaissance team, before she had held a crippled Harrier in the air for 43 minutes past its structural limits, bleeding hydraulic fluid and trailing smoke, refusing to punch out until every Marine on the ground was safely aboard the rescue helicopter. Before she had become a ghost in her own right, disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery that protects America's deepest secrets. The woman those Marines saluted was officially dead, killed in action over the Horn of Africa on a Tuesday in October that the calendar claimed never existed. The truth was far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. Valentina had survived that mission, but barely. Her Harrier had disintegrated around her during the final approach to the recovery ship, forcing an ejection so violent it had left her with compression fractures in 3 vertebrae and a traumatic brain injury that had stolen 6 months of her memory. When she finally awakened in a military hospital whose location was classified above her security clearance, she discovered that Major Valentina Reyes no longer existed. The official story was clean and simple. Engine failure over international waters, aircraft and pilot lost at sea, body never recovered. Her personnel file had been sealed, her decorations locked away, her very existence scrubbed from the public record. The woman who had once been the Marine Corps' most decorated female pilot had become a footnote in classified files, a name whispered in the halls of the Pentagon by officers who remembered when the Corps still flew Harriers. She had spent the next 15 years in a strange kind of purgatory, receiving a government pension under an assumed identity while being forbidden from discussing her service or even acknowledging her real name. The military had given her a new life but taken away her purpose, leaving her to drift through civilian existence like a spirit haunting its own grave. The surplus store had become her weekly pilgrimage, a small rebellion against the anonymity that had been forced upon her. She would buy insignificant items, bootlaces, field rations, cleaning supplies, just to be around the familiar smell of military gear and the comfort of young Marines who reminded her of the pilots she had once led into combat. She never expected to be recognized. The pin on her jacket was supposed to be invisible to anyone without the proper clearance, and her squadron patch belonged to a unit that had been officially disbanded years before those Marines were even born. But military culture has a long memory, and legends have a way of persisting even when the powers that be would prefer they fade away. The lance corporal who had initiated the salute was named David Kowalski, and he would later tell investigators that something about her bearing had reminded him of his flight instructor at Pensacola, a gruff master sergeant who had flown with VMA 231 before the unit was deactivated. When he saw the patch and the pin together, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed suddenly clicked into place. His Instagram post about meeting a badass old-school Marine pilot had been online for exactly 17 minutes before it was taken down. But 17 minutes was long enough for it to be screenshot, shared, and disseminated through the underground network of military social media that exists parallel to official channels. Within hours, former Marines from across the country were studying the blurry photo Kowalski had managed to take, their faces lit by the glow of smartphone screens as they tried to identify the mysterious woman. The first positive identification came from a retired master gunnery sergeant in Virginia Beach who had served as a crew chief with VMA 231 during its final deployment. Thomas Bulldog Morrison had been cleaning the same Harrier that Ghost had flown on her last mission, and he would have recognized her silhouette against the sunrise of Judgment Day itself. His phone call to a buddy at Quantico was supposed to be casual, just old Marines sharing war stories and catching up on mutual friends. But when he mentioned seeing a photo of someone who looked exactly like Major Reyes, who was supposed to be 15 years dead, his buddy went quiet for a long time before promising to make some calls. Those calls rippled upward through the chain of command like electricity through copper wire. Within 24 hours, a colonel at Headquarters Marine Corps was pulling files that hadn't been touched since the day they were sealed. Within 48 hours, a general was asking questions that made his staff extremely uncomfortable. Within 72 hours, someone very high in the intelligence community was having a very quiet conversation with someone even higher about the potential security implications of a dead pilot walking around San Diego County with a chest full of classified decorations. But by then, it was too late to put the ghost back in the machine. The story had taken on a life of its own, spreading through the viral pathways of military culture with the unstoppable momentum of an urban legend becoming truth. Veterans who had never heard of Operation Ghostwalk were sharing the story anyway, because it represented something they all understood: the way military service could both elevate and consume the people who answered its call. Valentina Reyes became a symbol before she became a person again. She represented every veteran who had been forgotten by the system they served, every pilot who had pushed their aircraft past its limits to bring their people home, every Marine who had disappeared into the classified shadows where heroism goes to die. The fact that she was a woman only amplified the story's power, because it spoke to decades of female military service that had been overlooked, undervalued, or deliberately obscured. The Marine Corps found itself in an impossible position. They couldn't acknowledge her existence without admitting to Operation Ghostwalk, but they couldn't deny her heroism without dishonoring one of the most decorated pilots in their history. The compromise was a masterpiece of military bureaucracy. They would neither confirm nor deny anything, while quietly working to contain the damage and protect both Valentina's cover and the operational security that her supposed death was meant to preserve. But containment was proving more difficult than anyone had anticipated. Every attempt to scrub her story from social media only seemed to amplify interest. Every official "no comment" was interpreted as confirmation by a military community that had long ago learned to read between the lines of Pentagon doublespeak. The ghost was becoming flesh again, whether the powers that be liked it or not. Meanwhile, Valentina herself remained unaware of the storm gathering around her. She continued her quiet existence in a one-bedroom apartment near the beach, spending her days reading aviation magazines and her evenings walking the shoreline, where she could watch military aircraft from Miramar conducting training flights in the distance. The sound of jet engines was both torture and comfort, a reminder of the life that had been taken from her and the identity that she could never fully abandon. She had no social media accounts, no internet presence, and no way of knowing that her face was being shared across military networks by thousands of Marines who had never met her but somehow understood that her story was part of their story. She lived in the bubble of anonymity that the government had constructed around her, protected and imprisoned by the same security protocols that were supposed to keep her safe. The bubble burst on a Thursday morning when she opened her door to find two Marines in dress blues standing on her porch. One was a colonel she didn't recognize. The other was Master Gunnery Sergeant Morrison, who had aged 15 years since she'd last seen him, but still carried himself with the ramrod bearing of a career Marine. "Hello, Major," Morrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think it's time you knew what's been happening." The story they told her over the next 3 hours would have seemed impossible if it hadn't been coming from the mouths of men she trusted. Her face was everywhere, they explained, shared by Marines who recognized something in her that they couldn't quite name but instinctively saluted. The military hierarchy was scrambling to manage the fallout, while veterans across the country were demanding answers about why one of their greatest heroes had been erased from history. "The cat's out of the bag, ma'am," the colonel said, his tone respectful but tinged with frustration. We can try to stuff it back in, but it's going to be messy for everyone involved. Or, he paused, looking directly at her with the kind of straightforward honesty that only comes from career military officers. We can try a different approach. The different approach, as it turned out, was as radical as it was simple. Tell the truth. Not all of it. Operation Ghostwalk would remain classified until the heat death of the universe, but enough of it to acknowledge that Major Valentina Ghost Reyes had served her country with extraordinary distinction and deserved better than bureaucratic erasure. The proposal was audacious in its simplicity. A carefully orchestrated ceremony at Marine Corps Air Station Miramar, where she would be publicly recognized for her service and presented with a medal that could be worn openly. The Distinguished Flying Cross she had earned for her final mission could never be acknowledged, but there were other decorations from her earlier service that could be celebrated without compromising national security. It would require careful choreography and the cooperation of senior leadership all the way to the Pentagon, but it was possible. The alternative was allowing her story to continue spreading through unofficial channels, where it could eventually become entangled with conspiracy theories and anti-government sentiment that would serve no one's interests. Valentina listened to their proposal with the same calm attention she had once brought to mission briefings, asking tactical questions about implementation and security implications. But beneath her composed exterior, something was stirring. A part of herself that had been sleeping for 15 years was beginning to wake up. "What about operational security?" she asked, her mind automatically cataloging the potential risks. "What about the other members of the team who are still undercover?" "Already considered," the colonel replied. "Your official resurrection would actually provide better cover for the ongoing operations. Sometimes the best way to hide a secret is to distract people with a different truth." She walked to her window and looked out at the Pacific, where the late afternoon sun was painting the waves in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere out there, young Marines were learning to fly the aircraft that had replaced her beloved Harriers. They were preparing for missions that might require the same kind of courage and sacrifice that had once defined her life. "I've been dead for 15 years, she said quietly. "It might be time to try living again." The ceremony took place 3 weeks later, on a crisp December morning when the California sky was so clear it seemed infinite. The guest list was carefully curated, a mix of active-duty Marines, retired veterans, and selected media representatives who had been thoroughly briefed on what could and could not be discussed. Valentina stood at attention in a dress blue uniform that had been tailored to accommodate the slight changes in her frame over the past decade and a half. The decorations on her chest told only part of her story, but they were enough to make her point. She was real, she had served, and she had earned the right to be remembered. The base commander, a brigadier general who had flown FA-18s during the same era when Ghost was terrorizing enemy positions from her Harrier cockpit, delivered remarks that were measured but heartfelt. He spoke about service and sacrifice, about the Marines who serve in the shadows and the debt that can never be fully repaid. He didn't mention Operation Ghostwalk by name, but everyone in the audience understood that they were witnessing the rehabilitation of someone whose heroism had been buried for reasons they might never fully understand. When he called her forward to receive the Navy Commendation Medal for her actions during Operation Desert Shield, a mission that predated her classified service and could be safely acknowledged, the silence was absolute. Every Marine in the audience came to attention as she approached the platform, their heels clicking together in a symphony of military precision that echoed across the flight line. The medal itself was insignificant compared to the decorations she had earned in the classified world, but its meaning was profound. It represented acknowledgement, recognition, and the restoration of an identity that had been stolen from her in the name of national security. When the general pinned it to her uniform, she felt something shift inside her chest. A weight she had been carrying for 15 years suddenly seemed lighter. But the real moment came afterward, during the informal reception in the base officers' club. She was standing near a window that overlooked the flight line, watching a formation of F-35Bs practicing landing patterns, when she felt someone approach from behind. Major Reyes. She turned to find Lance Corporal Kowalski, still baby-faced but wearing his dress blues with the pride of a Marine who had discovered that his instincts had been correct. Behind him stood his two buddies from the surplus store, their eyes wide with the realization that they had been part of something larger than themselves. "We just wanted to thank you, ma'am," Kowalski said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, "for your service and for being who you are." She looked at their young faces and saw something that took her back 15 years to a ready room aboard the USS Bataan, where she had given final briefings to pilots who were about to fly into the unknown. They were so young, these Marines, but they carried themselves with the same mixture of confidence and vulnerability that she remembered from her own squadron. "No," she said, her voice carrying the warmth that had once made her the most beloved officer in VMA 231. "Thank you, all of you, for reminding me who I used to be." The conversation that followed was awkward at first. What do you say to a legend who has been officially dead for 15 years? But gradually settled into the comfortable rhythm of Marines talking to Marines. They asked about flying Harriers, about what it was like to be one of the few women in Marine aviation during the 1990s, about the differences between military service then and now. She answered their questions with the patience of someone who understood that she had become a bridge between eras, a living link to a Marine Corps that existed only in memory and war stories. But as they talked, she began to understand something that the colonels and generals who had orchestrated her resurrection might have missed. The young Marines looking up at her with such obvious respect and admiration weren't just curious about her service. They were hungry for connection to something larger than themselves. In an era of social media and instant gratification, they were searching for the kind of meaning that could only come from understanding their place in a tradition that stretched back to the halls of Montezuma and the shores of Tripoli. She was more than a decorated pilot who had been erased from history. She was a keeper of the flame, a guardian of values and traditions that risked being lost in the shuffle of modernization and technological change. The salute those three Marines had rendered in the surplus store hadn't just been recognition of her individual service. It had been an acknowledgement of everything she represented. As the reception wound down and the guests began to filter out into the California evening, Valentina found herself alone on the balcony overlooking the flight line. The sound of jet engines had faded to a distant whisper, replaced by the gentle Pacific breeze that carried the scent of aviation fuel and possibility. For the first time in 15 years, she felt like Major Valentina Ghost Reyes again. Not the sanitized version that had been presented to the media, but the complete person who had lived through triumph and tragedy, heroism and heartbreak, service and sacrifice. She was no longer a ghost haunting her own grave. She was alive, acknowledged, and ready to figure out what came next. The story of her resurrection would continue to ripple through military culture for months to come, inspiring other buried heroes to step forward and claim their place in history. But that night, standing alone under the vast California sky, she was simply a Marine who had found her way home.